There are two distinct economic events embedded in the word war. The first is the shock, the immediate, violent repricing of risk that occurs in the hours and days following the outbreak of hostilities, when markets absorb the news of conflict and adjust prices to reflect a new probability distribution of outcomes. The second is the structural, the recalibration that occurs when markets understand that the conflict is not a temporary disruption to be priced through and recovered from, but a persistent condition that rewrites the operating assumptions of the global economy for an indefinite forward period. The first event has already been documented in this series. The 9% crude spike, the tanker strikes, the insurance withdrawal, the force majeure cascade, the planned naval escort, all of these were the shock phase of Operation Epic Fury's economic consequences, the market's initial response to a conflict that most participants were still pricing as bounded, resolvable, and ultimately temporary. On March 3, 2026, the second event began. President Trump's public signal that the operation would extend well beyond the initial 4 to 5 week timeline, that this was not a surgical intervention with a defined exit, but a structural commitment with an open duration, coincided with a statement from Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps commanders, broadcast on Iranian state television, that the Strait of Hormuz was closed to all commercial traffic, and that any vessel attempting transit would be treated as a legitimate military target. Not threatened with closure, not subject to elevated risk, closed, with explicit public broadcast notice that the closing would be enforced with lethal force against any vessel that tested it. Brent crude crossed $82 per barrel before the Asian trading session closed on March 3rd. The forward guidance from energy trading desks that had been warning about $100 per barrel since March 2nd shifted from conditional to baseline. The shock phase is over. The structural phase has begun, and the structural phase of an indefinitely prolonged conflict involving the permanent closure of the world's primary oil transit corridor does not produce a temporary inflation spike that central banks can look through and patient consumers can absorb. It produces stagflation, the specific, brutal, and policy-resistant combination of rising prices and slowing economic growth that represents the most difficult macroeconomic environment that modern central banking has ever been asked to manage. To understand the brutal math connecting an IRGC broadcast from Tehran to the interest rate decisions of the Federal Reserve and the Bank of England, and what that connection means for the purchasing power of every household in the Western world, make sure you are subscribed to this intelligence network. The analysis that follows is the economic reality of March 3rd. The IRGC's closure statement, broadcast on state television on the morning of March 3rd, is not the first time Iranian commanders have threatened the Strait of Hormuz. The threat has been a recurring feature of Iranian strategic communication since the 1980s, deployed with sufficient regularity that Western energy market analysts developed frameworks for discounting it, distinguishing between rhetorical closure threats issued for diplomatic leverage and operational closure signals backed by demonstrable military preparation. The March 3 statement falls into a different category than any of its predecessors, for reasons that are structural rather than rhetorical. The Iranian government that issued previous closure threats was a sovereign state with a functioning institutional interest in preserving the option value of the threat. A threat that could only retain leverage if it was never fully executed, because execution would trigger the military response that a functioning Iranian state needed to avoid. The Iranian state apparatus that broadcast the March 3 closure statement is operating under fundamentally different conditions. Its supreme leadership is dead. Its central command and control architecture has been degraded to a degree that makes the distinction between authorized IRGC action and unauthorized factional action operationally irrelevant to the vessels that would be targeted by either. And critically, its institutional interest in preserving option value has been eliminated, along with the institutional structure that held that interest. A fragmented IRGC with no functioning central authority to impose strategic restraint does not make closure threats for leverage. It makes closure statements as operational doctrine, as the default military posture of an organization that has lost its government and retained its weapons. The commercial shipping industry's response to this specific combination of factors, explicit closure declaration, lethal force authorization, fragmented command and control making negotiated exceptions impossible, and insurance market withdrawal making commercial risk transfer unavailable, is not elevated caution. It is complete cessation. There is no risk premium at which a tanker operator will instruct a crew to transit a waterway where a fragmented military organization with an indeterminate chain of command has publicly stated its intention to fire on them. The market for transit risk does not reprice to reflect this environment. It closes. The physical consequence of that closure falls with maximum severity on the economies that the preceding analysis has documented as structurally dependent on Hormuz transit. But the March 3 statement transforms the analytical framework for assessing that impact from a disruption scenario into a sustained deprivation scenario. A disruption has a duration that can be estimated and a resolution pathway that can be modeled. A sustained deprivation, the indefinite unavailability of a critical input to an economy with no adequate substitute, is a different economic condition that operates through different mechanisms and produces different outcomes. India's exposure to the March 3 closure is the cleanest illustration of the distinction. Approximately 50% of India's total crude oil imports, representing roughly 2.5 million barrels of daily supply, transits the Strait of Hormuz, or originates from Persian Gulf producers, whose export routes are exclusively Gulf-dependent. India's strategic petroleum reserve, while expanded significantly following the disruption signals of the preceding days, holds sufficient volume to sustain approximately 30 days of imports at normal consumption rates, before rationing becomes unavoidable. 30 days is a disruption buffer. It is not a structural deprivation buffer. At 30 days, if Hormuz remains closed and no alternative supply at adequate volume has been secured, Indian refinery throughput begins declining. Industrial power generation, which in India relies heavily on naphtha and fuel oil produced from Gulf crude, faces input constraints that translate directly into power availability for the manufacturing sector. The textile industry, the pharmaceutical sector, the automotive supply chain, and the steel and aluminum production facilities that form the backbone of India's export economy all operate on power supply assumptions that a sustained Hormuz closure destroys. The economic cost of a 30-day complete cessation of Gulf crude imports to India, modeled against the country's reserve buffer capacity, its alternative sourcing options from West Africa and the Americas, and the production loss in energy-intensive export sectors, runs into the tens of billions of dollars before any secondary inflation effects are incorporated. At 60 days, the cost structure changes qualitatively, not just quantitatively. At 60 days, reserve depletion begins forcing explicit rationing decisions, choices about which industrial users receive available supply and which do not, that generate their own economic costs through production disruption, contract defaults, and the loss of international market share in export sectors that cannot maintain delivery commitments. China faces the same arithmetic at larger absolute scale, with the partial mitigation of its more developed alternative sourcing relationships with Russian producers. Relationships that, as the preceding analysis documented, carry their own logistical constraints and cannot fully substitute for the Gulf supply volume that Hormuz closure removes from the Chinese energy system. The aggregate demand destruction in Asian manufacturing that this supply shock produces is the transmission mechanism through which the Hormuz closure reaches Western central banks, and it reaches them at the worst possible moment in their recent policy cycle. The Federal Reserve entered 2026 in a posture of carefully prepared easing. 2 years of aggressive rate increases had brought U.S. inflation from its 2022-2023 peak back toward the 2% target. The labor market had softened enough to make the inflationary risk of rate cuts manageable. Market consensus entering the year had priced in 2 to 3 rate cuts in 2026 as the Fed completed its policy normalization cycle. The Bank of England and the European Central Bank were in similar positions. Years of restrictive monetary policy having successfully reduced headline inflation, with rate cut cycles either underway or immediately anticipated. Operation Epic Fury and the IRGC closure declaration have not simply complicated that easing cycle. They have placed central banks in a position where the standard tools of monetary policy are oriented in the wrong direction for the problem they now face. The mechanism that produces this policy trap is stagflation. And understanding why stagflation is uniquely resistant to conventional monetary intervention requires tracing the specific pathway through which an energy supply shock generates both inflation and economic contraction simultaneously. The inflation component is straightforward and has been documented in the preceding analysis. Crude oil at $82 per barrel, and the forward market's baseline scenario of $100 if the closure persists, translates into retail gasoline prices, heating costs, transportation surcharges, and manufacturing input cost increases that feed into every price index in every Western economy within 4 to 8 weeks. The Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco's research, cited in the preceding analysis, estimates that a $10 increase in crude prices adds approximately 0.2 to 0.3 percentage points to the U.S. CPI over 12 months. A move from $72 to $100, a $28 increase, implies a CPI contribution of between 0.6 and 0.8 percentage points of additional annual inflation. In an economy where the Fed's target is 2%, and where the terminal rate of the preceding tightening cycle was calibrated to bring inflation to that target, an additional 0.75 of a percentage point of supply-driven inflation does not merely delay rate cuts. It makes the case for rate cuts, which require confidence that inflation is durably at target, analytically indefensible for as long as crude prices remain elevated. But here is where the stagflation trap becomes visible in its full severity. The same supply shock that is pushing inflation higher is simultaneously slowing the economic activity that generates the tax revenues, the corporate earnings, and the consumer spending that keep growth economies out of recession. Higher energy costs are, in economic terms, a tax on productive activity, a transfer of purchasing power from energy consumers to energy producers that reduces the disposable income available for other consumption and the operating margins available for investment. When that tax is imposed by a supply disruption rather than by a deliberate policy decision, its incidence falls most heavily on the sectors and households that are least able to absorb it. Low-income households, spending a higher fraction of their income on energy and transportation, manufacturing businesses with high energy intensity and thin margins, and logistics-dependent sectors where fuel costs represent a large share of operating expenses. The Federal Reserve, facing this combination of rising prices and slowing growth, confronts a policy menu with no good options. Raising interest rates to combat the inflation component of the stagflationary shock would accelerate the growth slowdown, increasing the cost of borrowing for businesses already facing higher input costs and consumers already facing higher energy prices, pushing an economy that is slowing toward contraction. Cutting interest rates to support growth would validate the inflationary signal. Reducing the cost of borrowing in an environment where prices are already rising faster than target, risking a de-anchoring of inflation expectations that would require an even more severe tightening cycle to reverse. Holding rates steady, the third option, provides neither stimulus to a slowing economy nor restraint to an accelerating price level, leaving the central bank in a passive position while the supply shock works its way through the system. This is precisely the policy trap that characterized the 1973, 1974, and 1979-1980 stagflationary episodes, the two periods in the post-World War II era that best illuminate the economic conditions now taking shape. In both cases, energy supply shocks originating in the Persian Gulf produced combinations of rising prices and slowing growth that were resistant to monetary policy intervention because their cause was supply side rather than demand side. The Federal Reserve of the 1970s ultimately broke the stagflationary cycle through the Volcker shock, a dramatic increase in interest rates to above 20% that crushed inflation, but also produced the deepest recession since the Great Depression. The Federal Reserve of 2026 enters this environment with a federal debt level that makes Volcker's scale rate increases fiscally catastrophic. Each percentage point increase in the federal funds rate adds tens of billions of dollars to the government's annual interest expense on its $30+ trillion debt load. The policy space available to the modern Fed to combat a stagflationary supply shock is, therefore, constrained in ways that the 1979 Fed was not. Constrained by fiscal dominance, by the debt service mathematics of a government whose borrowing costs are acutely sensitive to interest rate levels. The Bank of England faces an analogous constraint within the context of a UK economy even more exposed to import cost inflation than the United States, given the UK's higher energy import dependency and the pound sterling's greater sensitivity to external account deterioration than the dollar. The European Central Bank, managing monetary policy for an 18 economy bloc with divergent fiscal positions and energy import dependencies, faces the additional complication that the stagflationary shock falls unevenly across member states, hitting energy-intensive manufacturing economies like Germany harder than less energy-intensive service economies, creating political pressure on ECB policy that a national central bank does not face. What the IRGC's March 3 broadcast produced in the architecture of the global monetary system is not a temporary complication for central bank policy calendars. It is the indefinite postponement of the easing cycle that global financial markets had priced in, and the substitution, in its place, of a hold-and-watch posture that provides no support to slowing economies and no restraint to accelerating prices. The economic consequence of that substitution reaches every household in the Western world through the same transmission mechanism that every energy supply shock has used throughout the history of the industrial economy. It arrives as the gap between what things cost and what wages buy, as the heating bill that is larger than last winter's, as the grocery receipt whose total has increased without the basket changing, as the mortgage rate that is not falling when the borrower needs it to, as the raise that does not cover the inflation rate and therefore represents a real wage cut disguised as a nominal wage increase. These are the consequences of a barrel of crude at $100 in an economy that runs on energy. They are not distributed evenly. They fall hardest on the households with the least financial buffer, the most energy-intensive consumption patterns, and the fewest options for substituting away from the inputs whose prices have risen. The regressive incidence of energy price inflation is the most well-documented fact in the economics of commodity supply shocks. It is also the most politically volatile, because the households that bear the highest proportional burden of the shock are the households most likely to translate that burden into electoral and social pressure on the governments that, at least in the public perception, authorized the military operation that produced it. Operation Epic Fury was authorized by policymakers who calculated that its military objectives justified its military costs. The economic costs were not absent from those calculations. No serious strategic planning process ignores energy market implications entirely. But the calculations that are most subject to optimistic bias in military planning are the duration assumptions, the estimates of how quickly the operation achieves its objectives, how quickly the disrupted systems stabilize, and how quickly the economic costs therefore cease accumulating. March 3's twin signals, an extended timeline from the US government and a permanent closure declaration from the IRGC, have simultaneously invalidated the optimistic duration assumptions and replaced them with an open-ended scenario whose economic cost function has no defined terminal point. The cost of a closed Strait of Hormuz is not a fixed expense that can be budgeted and absorbed. It is a daily accumulation in crude prices, in Asian manufacturing margins, in central bank policy constraints, and consumer purchasing power erosion that compounds as long as the closure persists. Every day that Brent crude trades above the pre-conflict baseline is another day of stagflationary pressure embedded in the price level of the global economy. Every day that central banks cannot cut rates because of that pressure is another day of foregone economic stimulus whose absence slows growth in every rate-sensitive sector. Every day that Asian factories face energy rationing is another day of supply constraint that will propagate into Western consumer goods prices 4 to 8 weeks later. You cannot bomb the world's energy jugular without strangling your own economy, not because the two are politically connected, but because they are physically connected by pipelines and tanker routes and insurance contracts and futures curves and central bank reaction functions in ways that respect no political boundary and acknowledge no military objective. The Strait of Hormuz is 21 nautical miles wide. The economic shockwave that radiates from its closure is global, and on March 3, 2026, that shockwave is no longer a risk scenario being priced at the margins of energy futures curves. It is the baseline.